No one who boards a generation ship ever gets anywhere.
That's not a flaw in the plan. It's the plan.
The closest star system to ours is about 4.25 light-years away, nearly 40 trillion kilometers. It's the shortest interstellar distance that any journey from here will ever encounter. At the other end, there's a yellow star similar to ours, an orange companion that's cooler and smaller, and a faint red dwarf, almost invisible to the naked eye, in a huge orbit. The two larger stars orbit each other in an orbit that takes about 80 years.
A generation ship isn't defined by its engine. It's defined by arithmetic. At 1% of the speed of light, about 3,000 km per second, the crossing takes around 785 years. At 0.5%, 850. At 2%, just over 2,000. These are the speeds that a real spacecraft, capable of carrying people and then slowing down again upon arrival, can achieve. The probes that reach 10% of the speed of light don't carry anyone. They are made to fly past their destination and keep going forever. The moment a mission needs to slow down and actually stop, the practical speed collapses, and the journey ends up taking longer than any human lifetime.
That's why the generation ship exists as an idea. It's not a romantic choice. It's what's left when you accept the distance and still refuse to give up on taking people. 425 years. In a generation of 25 to 30 years, that's between 15 and 17 generations. If you count that time backwards from today, you reach the era of the first telescopes. Every person who lived and died between that moment and this one would fit within a single crossing. That's how you should imagine the scale of this journey. Not in kilometers, in whole lifetimes stacked on top of one another. The hull would be enormous. From tens of thousands of tons, in the most streamlined design possible, to several million tons in the versions designed to support a truly self-sufficient population. In the 1950s and 1960s, Freeman Dyson and Theodore Taylor studied ships powered by pulses from nuclear explosions. The Orion project, with interstellar variants reaching millions of tons. In almost every such project, propulsion is a small fraction of the total. Most of the mass is habitat, shielding, water, agriculture, and the industrial capacity to repair what breaks. The departure would be rather undramatic. Continuous low-thrust propulsion means acceleration at a fraction of Earth's gravity. No one on board would feel any liftoff. Reaching 1% of the speed of light at this rate takes about 8 years of continuous burn. At a rate 10 times weaker, 80 years. The acceleration phase alone can last longer than an entire childhood. During these years, the solar system is left behind in stages that are easy to name and almost impossible to see. The orbit of the most distant planet, about 30 times the distance from Earth to the Sun, is crossed in less than a month. The boundary where the solar wind gives way to interstellar gas, about 120 times that distance, is reached around 70 days after the engines settle. And visually, nothing happens. Only the instruments can detect it. It's the most significant boundary of the solar system, and it's completely invisible. Even so, the spacecraft still hasn't left. The sparse shell of icy bodies that surrounds everything extends to about 100,000 times the distance from Earth to the Sun. That's roughly a light year and a half. At 1% the speed of light, crossing that takes nearly 160 years. Nothing changes in everyday life. The Sun stops being a disk and becomes a point of light after about 8 years of travel. There is no announcement. In a year, it is a small and bright disk. A few seasons later, It's just the brightest star in the sky, and no one would be able to point out the exact day when that changed. From then on, it behaves like any other star, just brighter, until, upon arrival, it becomes just an ordinary star among so many others, in a constellation that no one ever drew. The interstellar medium isn't empty, but it's close. About 1 atom per cubic centimeter, compared to billions upon billions of atoms in the same volume of room air. Relativity at 1% of the speed of light is practically irrelevant. The clocks on board lag behind those on Earth by only a few weeks over the entire 400 years. No one on board jumps ahead in time. The 400 years have to be lived hour by people taking turns. And that's the shape of the thing that matters most. A generation ship carries 3 populations, and only one is actually traveling. The first group remembers the sky and understands the mission as a decision they made. The last group arrives. They see a star become a place, and they understand the mission as an event about to happen to them. Between the two, 10 or 20 generations do neither one nor the other. They are born into a world already in motion. They live their whole lives there, and they die without anything changing. It is in this vast in-between that the journey truly takes place. The ship starts out as a vehicle. In a century, it has become a place. The gravity on board is created by rotation. The habitat rotates around an axis. And what the residents feel as gravity is the floor pushing inward, keeping each person on a circular path that would otherwise go straight. The force of that weight is the radius of the habitat multiplied by the square of the rotation speed. Bigger and slower seems right. Smaller and faster seems wrong in a way that's impossible to ignore. This trade-off between size and spin speed is the most consequential decision in the entire project. To produce gravity equal to Earth's at 2 rotations per minute, the habitat needs a radius of about 224 meters. At 4 rotations, 56 meters are enough. At 1 rotation, the radius exceeds 900 meters. Comfort is bought with structure. Structure is bought with mass. And mass has to be accelerated and then decelerated over 4 light years. The rotation limit doesn't come from engineering. It comes from the inner ear. Above about 2 turns per minute, moving your head creates an illusion that the world is tilting in a direction no one actually moved in. Training increases tolerance quite a bit, but never for everyone. And an aggressively designed spacecraft is one in which a fraction of the population would find this permanently unbearable. There's also a gradient. If you were standing in a spinning habitat, your head would weigh a little less than your feet. And there are everyday effects. Walking in the direction of the spin makes you heavier. Walking against it, lighter. Enough for a person to know which way they're facing just by the feeling in their legs. Loose objects don't fall straight down. They drift backward from where they should. Effect of rotation. Every child raised on board would grow up with that curve built into their reflexes and would genuinely find a perfectly straight fall strange. If you arrived from Earth, you would miss every ball thrown because your body expects physics that doesn't exist there. On the axis of rotation, there is no weight at all. And that's where storage, manufacturing, medical facilities, and recreation would be located. Because a place where a person can float is the closest thing to a genuinely new experience that the closed world can offer. And the ground curves upward in a cylinder. The entire landscape is a continuous loop with no horizon anywhere. None of this would seem remarkable to someone who was born there. It would be learned before language. It is the recordings from Earth that would seem wrong. There's also the less pleasant part. The interfaces between the spinning section and the stationary spine, where the body accepts that its own weight is a local convention. Areas where motion sickness is worst, made into workspaces for those who tolerate the crossing well. And a spinning habitat is a gyroscope.
It resists being turned.
So any change of direction has to overcome its own spin. And any shift of mass inside the habitat, water moving between tanks, people gathering in a single section, disturbs the axis, requiring continuous correction for centuries without a single pause. The rotation, moreover, offers no protection whatsoever against radiation. Every ton of shielding adds to every ton already required by the spin. The reason why all this complexity is accepted is that the alternative has already been measured, and it's not encouraging. In the absence of weight, bone is lost at a rate of 1 to 2% per month, compared to 1 to 2% per year in the worst bone loss on Earth. NASA research with long-duration astronauts on the International Space Station documents exactly this range. Muscle, heart, fluids, and vision also change. And some of these changes don't fully reverse. For 6 months, that's not decisive. For a person who will be born, grow up, and die without leaving the habitat, it's decisive. And no human being has ever developed under anything other than full Earth gravity. That's the deepest gap in the whole idea. Human physiology has only been measured in full gravity and effectively in no gravity at all. Everything in between is extrapolation between 2 points. A ship that chooses a cheaper fraction of gravity is running an experiment on its own descendants, 15 times in a row with no control group and no way to stop. There is a kinder possibility. The inner ear calibrates itself during development, and a baby raised already spinning might tolerate speeds that would incapacitate an adult coming from Earth. Everything a person on board consumes has to come back. An adult uses about 1 kilogram of oxygen per day. The daily demand for water, including washing and food preparation, reaches dozens of liters. Multiply that by 1,000 people in 425 years, and the totals become impossible to carry. Just the oxygen alone would add up to hundreds of thousands of tons. Nothing can be stored. Everything has to circulate. Food has to be grown continuously under lights generated by the ship itself. Estimates for intensive hydroponic agriculture range from 20 to 50 square meters of cultivated area per person, and that number practically doubles when you add processing, storage, and reserves. A crew of 1,000 people means a working farm measured in tens of thousands of square meters, operating every day for centuries without a single bad harvest allowed. What is known about closed ecologies is not reassuring. Biosphere 2 in Arizona, sealed in 1991. Lost oxygen from 21 to about 14% in 16 months. John Severinghouse and colleagues, in a 1994 article in EOS magazine from the American Geophysical Union, showed the cause. Microorganisms in the soil consuming oxygen faster than any model predicted. And this should have shown up as an increase in carbon dioxide, but it didn't, because the concrete in the structure was still curing and absorbing that gas. 2 unrelated processes canceled each other out in the readings. The instruments were working perfectly, but the picture they painted was wrong.
The same experiment showed
That closed ecosystems.
simplify. Every pollinating insect has disappeared. Ants and cockroaches thrived. Venus covered the crops.
Smaller facilities did better. The Soviet Bios 3 complex in Krasnoyarsk supported small crews for up to 180 days, with water recycling reaching 85%. The lesson is clear. Closure is achievable when the system is small and managed ruthlessly, and it gets harder in proportion to how rich and varied the ecology is. A spacecraft needs to be both things at the same time. The most recent answer is to break the cycle into a chain of separate compartments, each doing work under controlled conditions, decomposing waste, cultivating bacteria, converting ammonia, growing algae, growing larger plants. Each compartment is simple enough to be understood and repaired, and the fragile behavior of the entire ecosystem becomes a series of industrial processes that just happen to be alive. It's less beautiful than a sealed garden and much more likely to keep working in year 300. All of this gives the air on board a particular character. It has a constant smell, invisible to those who grew up in it, and immediately obvious to a visitor. The air only moves because it is forced. Without weather, it goes wherever the fans push it. Humidity is a decision, not a condition. There is no rain or dew, and the water is never new. It passes through people, plants, and filters thousands of times. Nothing on board is ever more than a few weeks away from having been part of someone. Because of all this, the scariest events on board wouldn't be loud. In a closed world, catastrophe announces itself as a slow discrepancy, a fractional decline, and a drop in oxygen over months. A crop yield 4% below expectations for 3 seasons in a row. In a system where this is still within the normal range of variation, there is no alarm. There is a person looking at a column of numbers, gradually realizing that something in the cycle has been wrong for a long time. The standard defense isn't better agriculture. It's more farms, separated, redundant, so that if a pest infestation hits one of them, it doesn't reach the others. There is an image that people carry of what it would be like to travel between stars, and it involves stars flying past the window. Nothing like that would happen. At 1% of the speed of light, the apparent shift of the stars reaches half a degree, the width of the moon in Earth's sky. The instrument can measure it. It's not visible. The stars just stay still, and 15 generations would grow up under an almost identical sky. If you were one of them, the sky your great-grandparents saw would be, point by point, the same as the one you see. An ancient and silent library. Only 2 things change throughout the entire journey, and they change slowly. Behind, the sun darkens. Ahead, the destination brightens. Light years away, the sun would still be brighter than energy in Earth's sky. Halfway there, it has already faded into something ordinary. The destination, on the other hand, becomes 4 times brighter each time the remaining distance is halved, but it remains just a point until the ship is essentially already there. The transformation from star to sun happens entirely within a lifetime. The defining visual feature of a generation ship is not spectacle, it's stillness. The ship covers more than 600 times the distance from Earth to the sun every year, and the view out the window says nothing about that. Whether there would actually be windows is an open question. The shielding argues against it because every window is a weak point in a hull that needs to be thick. Psychology argues against it too, because a real view matters in a way that a screen can't replace. The compromise is usually light and vision through mirrors or heavily shielded openings. There's almost nothing to see out there. The void looks exactly empty because it's pretty close to that. But interstellar dust matters in ways you can't see. A single grain at that speed carries energy comparable to a rifle bullet, and the front shielding would be continuously worn down for 400 years without anyone on board ever seeing it. There is a real trade-off. After just a single year of cruising, the ship's observation baseline already surpasses any observatory near a planet, allowing distances to stars to be measured with unprecedented precision. And there's a small twist still to come. The destination isn't a star, it's 3. At some point in the final centuries, the single point ahead splits into 2, and much later a third, much fainter one, can be identified. It's the only thing in 400 years of sky that actually becomes more than it already was. On board, there is never silence. Fans, pumps, and compressors run nonstop. And underneath it all, there's the deep note of the hull turning, felt through the floor as much as heard. What's important about this background noise is what it means. A truly silent ship is a ship whose air has stopped moving. Silence on board isn't peace. It's the sound of a system that has stopped. And everyone would understand that right away, without needing to be taught. What's missing is everything else. Thunder, wind, rain, birds, except during the agricultural sessions. Every natural sound on board is a decision that was made, and most of them were made by people who died 3 centuries ago. Time is also manufactured. There is no sunrise, so the day has to be invented, because the human circadian rhythm naturally runs longer than 24 hours, and it drifts without an external cue. Light does that job. Bluish tone in the morning, warm light at night, gradual transition. This isn't decoration. It's the mechanism that keeps an entire society's sleep in sync, and it needs to work for 15 generations. Night on board would be a real event, even if there was nothing natural about it. The panels shift from white to amber, the ventilation changes tone, the agricultural sections darken in sequence. It's not a sunset. It's a very good imitation that's been running non-stop for 300 years. Seasons would also be invented, partly for agriculture, partly because monotony in a confined space slowly corrodes. And a world where nothing ever changes is hard to live an entire life in. The calendar itself loses its anchors. A year on board means nothing astronomically, and the units of measurement drift for local convenience, until the ship loses the ability to check itself against its own original engineering documents. Little is known about how people fare in this environment. The longest studies of sealed isolation last about 500 days. Winters in Antarctica last up to 9 months. Submarine patrols last only a few months. Nothing in the human record comes close to even a single generation on board, let alone 15. What these studies show is consistent. Morale drops around the mission's halfway point. Communication with the outside world drops, and morale depends more on meaningful work than on comfort. But there's a whole other difference. All these kinds of experiments had an outside, a set exit date. Aboard a generation ship, the middle generations have no date at all, because within their own lives, there is no outside at all. It's simply where they live. Privacy becomes a resource, not a preference. Contact with plants becomes almost a requirement, which is why gardens appear in every serious habitat proposal. Sleep would require attention that no short mission has ever had to give, managed through light and rhythm in the environment, not medication. What keeps groups cohesive during long isolations is consistent throughout the records. Music, ritual, shared meals, celebration. The deliberate marking of time by the group doing something together. A generation ship would develop its own festivals, with no external reference at all, celebrating departures that no one remembers and repairs that saved everyone. The first children born on board would arrive early within the first 3 decades. By the 100th year, the last person who remembers the sky is already very old. By the 2nd century, everyone alive was born on board. Everyone who chose the mission has already died, and the ship stops being a journey that anyone agreed to take. It simply becomes where everyone lives. This transition appears in the language before anywhere else. People stop saying on board and start saying here. The physical question underneath this is one that no one can answer. No human being has ever developed on anything other than full Earth gravity. And a ship that spins at a fraction of that is running an experiment on people, their own children. 15 times in a row with no way to fix the outcome if it goes wrong. Alongside that, there's the gentler possibility that the calibration of the inner ear during childhood could solve most of the problem on its own. And there's the issue of vocabulary, which is stranger than any physical problem. Words like horizon, climate, ocean, rain, crowd would no longer have anything to refer to. Surviving in the archive, as precise descriptions of things that can't be shown, Earth would become the most well-documented story in the ship's archive, known precisely and entirely secondhand, the way any of us knows the deep past. The education on board would have to teach two kinds of physics, the one that governs the ship, which can be tested at any time, and the one that governs planets, taught only in theory, to people who might never confirm any of it. After enough generations, everyone on board would be related to everyone else within a few degrees, a single extended family. And there's a reversal that's worth holding on to because it goes against the way this story is usually told. It's common to imagine the departure as a difficult moment. For almost everyone who's going to live on board, the departure isn't an experience at all. It's just a date in the logbook. The truly difficult moment belongs to the last generation, who will have to leave a world whose physics they completely understand for a place where the ground curves the wrong way and the sky moves. For those born on board, a planet is what feels strange. The arrival is the shock, not the departure. Around the 50th year, the engines go quiet, and then nothing of consequence happens for about 350 years. In that long meantime, the mission is not an experience, it's a background fact, like the age of a country. A person could live a full 80 years on board, contribute a lot, and never take an action meant to advance the journey. That's why confinement studies are of so little use here. They measure people who are waiting, and the middle generations aren't waiting for anything because there's no end expected within anyone's lifetime. What they have is a complete world with a dense history, periods remembered as difficult and good, old disputes, a generation known for having rebuilt the agricultural sections. I'm still not sure I've fully understood this part. Is it a burden or a liberation? There is a serious argument in favor of the second answer. A population that no longer sees itself as being in transit, no longer sees itself as deprived of something. There is no environment on Earth where the connection between a person's work and everyone's survival is as direct and obvious as it would be on board. The signal coming from home would be one of the strangest features of the middle centuries. The delay would grow until it stretched into years, then into a decade, and the content would drift out of usefulness. At some point, the transmissions would simply stop mattering and maybe stop altogether. The real separation wouldn't be the departure. It would be the year when the last message arrived and nothing else came after. The real risk isn't rebellion or despair. It's forgetting. Procedures are simplified because the reason for the complication is no longer remembered. Inspection intervals are extended because nothing has ever been found. Each decision is reasonable, and the mistakes accumulate in a direction that no one notices. Skill degrades faster than documentation. A craft without a practitioner disappears within a single generation because documentation preserves the steps, not the judgment. The ship would also visibly age, sections rebuilt in layers like a city, until there was a part of the structure never touched, the original from the beginning, the oldest thing in their world. The first crew volunteered, but no one after them did. Everyone born afterward ends up on a mission they didn't choose, in a place they can't leave. And the difference with a country is that a country's border can be crossed, but a ship's hull cannot. The practical form of the problem isn't resentment, it's drift. A comfortable population has no strong reason to prioritize an arrival that none of them will see, and very few human organizations have lasted 500 years with their original purpose intact. The proposed forms of government already have obvious weaknesses. Rotating councils dilute specialization. Technical guilds create hereditary power. Unchangeable constitutions fail in the face of the unforeseen. The environment imposes its own limits. Punishment is arithmetically difficult because there is no exile, nor space to waste labor on imprisonment. Justice would have to be restorative. And conflict has no geographical escape. The losing side of any dispute continues living in the same corridors as the winner indefinitely. There's also something strange about the decision-making. Any vote about the mission is made by people with no personal stake in the outcome, since the arrival is centuries beyond the lifetime of any voter, making permanent, irreversible decisions on behalf of those who have not been born yet. There is no version of onboard democracy where the ones making the decisions are the ones who will be affected. Long-lasting institutions on Earth, monastic orders, craft traditions have survived, not because of better documentation, but through ritual and repeated practice. Never letting a generation go by without someone doing the thing. A ship that wanted its life support discipline to survive for 4 centuries would probably have to make it ceremonial. That's why the destination would need to be kept visible and celebrated, not just recorded. A star that everyone points to, with festivals connected to it, has a chance of surviving for 15 generations. A line in a founding document doesn't. I disagree with some of the more aggressive proposals that come up at this point, carrying frozen embryos to expand the population during the journey, or using gene editing to shape those who arrive at the destination. Each one works on its own terms, and each one turns the population that comes off the ship into a designed population, rather than a descendant population. The failure that everyone genuinely fears isn't any of those. It's a population that keeps going just fine, gradually losing sight of what it's doing and why. This failure is silent, made entirely of reasonable decisions. Outside the planet's magnetic field, galactic cosmic radiation delivers something between 0.5 and 1 millisievert per day to an unshielded body. More or less the dose of a medical exam per day, non-stop, hitting you continuously if there was nothing between you and space. The Curiosity probe, on its way to Mars between 2011 and 2012, measured about 1.8 millisieverts per day during its cruise, according to a study published in 2013. Over 400 years, this adds up to hundreds of sieverts, compared to a dose of about 5 sieverts, which is lethal to half of the people exposed at once. Shielding is not optional. It's the prerequisite for the entire concept. The radiation itself is about 87 bare protons, 12 helium nuclei, and 1 heavier nucleus, which causes a disproportionate share of the damage. This creates the central paradox. A thin metal shield can be worse than none because the heavy nucleus breaks apart and produces a shower of secondary particles. What works is a volume rich in hydrogen, water, biomass. And matching the protection of Earth's atmosphere means about 10 tons of mass per square meter, the equivalent of 10 meters of water above your head. For a small probe, that's impossible. For a spacecraft already surrounded by water and food, it's practically free. The gene pool is a finite resource, in the most literal sense. Estimates of the minimum viable population range from about 100 people with strictly managed pairing and careful record keeping to several thousand if left to organize on its own. The difference doesn't come from biology. It comes from how much control the ship exerts over who has children with whom. 2 things erode a small, closed population: inbreeding depression, where recessive traits hidden in a large population start to appear as everyone becomes related to everyone else. And genetic drift, where variation is lost purely by chance, generation after generation. Neither of these can be reversed from within because there's nothing outside to mate with.
The standard mitigation is a cryobank brought from art, reintroducing variation over the centuries, which makes the ship's ancestry partly archival. Some of the parents of the 12th generation would be people who never even knew the ship existed. Selection would continue to act all the time. What arrives at the destination is not the population that left. It's a population measurably shaped by 4 centuries aboard a spaceship.
Medicine on board has a simple and tough problem. The medicine stock expires because medicines degrade over time. Radiation speeds up this process, and no plausible manifest carries 4 centuries worth of them. Everything would need to be synthesized on board, which means an entire chemical industry functioning as a life support system. Surgery is possible, but nothing about it is easy. No one has performed surgery in space. And even in a habitat spinning at a comfortable rate, sterile technique and training have to be reproduced over 15 generations with no external institution to certify any part of it. The less glamorous specialties like dentistry and obstetrics can't be lost, and none of them can be learned just from a document. Disease on board would take on a strange form. A closed community eventually eliminates infections that need a large population to persist, which would leave the ship remarkably free of common diseases, but also with no immunity at all to anything reintroduced. And even the human body itself contains naturally radioactive elements, decaying within its own tissue. Part of the exposure always comes from within. Language changes faster than you might expect. Portuguese from 400 years ago is already hard to read. A ship traveling at the speed of light experiences exactly that amount of change, isolated, with no external standard to correct itself. Shipboard terms would multiply. Planet-side terms would fossilize into formal vocabulary. The working language of the maintenance teams would evolve, while the manuals being written would not. And after being separated long enough, the manuals become subtly misleading, not incomprehensible. The archive has 3 problems that get harder in order. The storage media degrades and needs constant active copying. The machines that read this storage medium need to be manufactured on board, which argues for also maintaining a primitive layer, engraved in metal, readable without any technology. And the context, which no one has solved anywhere. Instructions that assume a shared background stop working when that background changes. Know-how is lost faster than any of that. A craft without a practitioner disappears in a generation because documentation preserves procedure, not judgment. After enough generations, records that no one can independently verify stop functioning as data and start functioning as inherited tradition. Treated with a seriousness that, from the outside, looks like reverence and may be the only thing that preserves it. Cultures that encoded information in story and ritual carried that information longer than cultures that only wrote it down and archived it, because a story is repeated and an archive is forgotten. Earth would exist on board as 3 things at the same time, all true, coordinates in a point of light behind, a huge archive of images and music, and a word carrying the weight of generations of use. None of them is a memory. No one on board has one. And there is one last form of drifting, the most human one. The meaning changes. The mission was carried out for reasons that made sense to a specific civilization, and those reasons might not convince people living centuries later in a closed world who never felt the fears of the founders. The ship would go on anyway. The machinery doesn't require anyone to be moved by the original argument. As long as the water keeps circulating and the children keep being taught, the reasons can drift as much as they want. The speed doesn't change. No spacecraft built by humans has operated for much more than half a century, and those that came close are simple, cold, almost shut down. A generation ship needs a complex and warm system, working non-stop for 8 times longer than anything ever made. The processes that wear it down are slow and well understood. In a vacuum, clean metal surfaces weld themselves together. Soft materials like seals and gaskets become brittle under sustained radiation. And a seal designed for 30 years installed 200 years ago is no longer a seal. Redundancy protects against accidents, not against age. Identical components from the same batch fail almost at the same time, for the same reason. Spare parts run out because no manifest carries 400 years worth of them. The ship needs to manufacture almost everything it contains, which requires an entire industrial base condensed into about 1,000 people, who also grow their own food. The consequence is that simplicity beats performance throughout the entire system. The repairable version outlasts the efficient one by a huge margin. Over 400 years, almost the entire ship ends up being replaced. The ship of Theseus becomes a maintenance log. The ship that arrives is the same in continuity and name, but almost none of it is the same material. On the outside, erosion is continuous. Interstellar dust hitting the forward surfaces for 4 centuries straight, contained by a sacrificial shield in front of the hull. Energy is problematic. For one thing, radioisotope sources decay with a half-life of about 88 years, which makes them useless for such a long journey. The ship needs to run on fission or fusion, with a reactor maintained for 15 generations. Self-repairing systems only shift the problem instead of removing it. If the ship manufactures its own parts, the factory is the one thing that can never break. Software ages in a way that nothing physical does. Code written centuries ago, in a language no one speaks anymore in daily life, controlling systems that lives depend on. It can't be safely rewritten, nor can it be left as it is. The result is that emergencies would rarely look like emergencies. Catastrophe arrives as something drawn out over time. A bearing running hotter for years, inspection interval quietly extended by someone reasonable generations ago. And there is an item that stands apart from all the others, because it needs to work exactly once. The propulsion system spends most of the journey turned off, maintained by people who have never seen it operate, and it needs to restart correctly at the midpoint of the crossing. Every other system proves itself every day. This one doesn't prove anything until the moment it matters. Slowing down is half the mission, and it's routinely left out of the discussion. Almost every interstellar concept is a flyby design, with no people on board, because losing all that speed costs as much as it did to gain it. At the halfway point, the ship flips upside down and burns against its own direction of travel, the most significant event in the middle of the journey, scheduled generations in advance. There are ways to slow down without carrying fuel. A magnetic sail against the stellar wind of the destination, or a light sail catching the light from the very star you are arriving at. The final deceleration phase can last from 30 to 40 years, and during this time, the target does what nothing has done for 400 years. It changes visibly, splits into 2 points, and finally becomes a disk with a measurable width. Someone on board would be the first person in 15 generations to see a star take shape. This generation faces a problem for which no one has prepared them. The departing crew trains to cross interstellar space. The ones who arrive have never entered an orbit, never landed anything anywhere. All the arrival skills have been theoretical for 400 years, taught by people who never use them. There's a serious possibility that they simply won't land. A ship that supported a population for 4 centuries has already solved the problem that the planet was supposed to solve. Closed-cycle life support, industrial self-sufficiency, social continuity for 15 generations. They could stay on board, mine the new system, build a second ship. By every practical measure, this would be a successful mission, differing from the original intent only in intent. Communication with home would have stretched even further. A message from the destination takes more than 4 years to reach Earth. And the answer, if it comes, arrives from a civilization almost a decade ahead of the one that heard it. Less of a conversation than 2 files sent back and forth. And there's the risk of faster ships. If propulsion improves, a ship launched later could arrive first, which creates the paradox that a civilization that always waits never goes anywhere. Compared to the alternatives, deep torpor or embryo ships, the generation ship has an advantage. It doesn't use technology that doesn't exist yet and keeps people awake and in control for the entire journey. They call it an impossible journey. And the word is accurate, though not in the way people usually think. Nothing about this violates the laws of physics. It's only impossible in this sense. It can't be done by a single traveler. A human life is far too short for that distance, by a factor of 5. The journey is only possible for a lineage, passed down intact through 15 pairs of hands that never meet. And that's what the ship really is. It starts as a vehicle, but within a century, it has already become a world. And it continues being a world for 300 years with history, festivals, disputes, music, and a cemetery that is also a garden. Then, within one final generation's lifetime, it becomes a vehicle again and does what it was built to do, for people who had almost stopped thinking of it as something that could really happen. I started looking at the night sky differently after understanding these calculations. I no longer see just the distance. I see the time that such a journey would require from no one in particular and from entire generations at the same time. And that changes little about how I think about anything that depends on someone finishing what they started. Maybe it also changes how you look at any star you decide to look for tonight, knowing that its light took too long to get here and that the distance it carries is greater than an entire lifetime. But after all that, the part that really matters isn't the arrival, and it never was. It's the part in between. It's the centuries in which 1,000 people, born and dying in the deepest darkness there is, ran a world properly. They kept the water clean, harvested the crops, kept the records readable, taught the children 2 kinds of physics, and dimmed the lights at night because it was good for people to have a night. Nothing out there notices. Nothing out there ever notices. And so the ship goes on, carrying its own manufactured dusk, through an unchanging darkness, with everyone who built it long dead, and everyone who will arrive not yet born. Somewhere in the middle of this long journey, a world is simply being lived, slowly, carefully, and well.